Are you familiar with this piece of crap? He was born in November of 1943. He was the oldest of two children raised by Michael and Ellen Heidnik, his parents. But the kids weren't raised in the home with both of their parents. Michael and Ellen divorced by the time Gary was only 3 years old. Gary claimed that he suffered a lot of emotional abuse by his father, specifically due to his bedwetting. Whatever reason, Gary continued to wet the bed for years and years after moving in with his father. So then Gary was sent to military school, which was probably somewhat nice compared to his home life because of how toxic it was. Everything seemed to be going really well for Gary, doing really well since going to military school and then the army. And then things just started to go downhill for Gary. He began to feel really unwell. It's a little unclear as to how it went from feeling nauseous and dizzy to a serious mental illness, but there's really not much I could find about it. He was then discharged from the military with a full disability pension. And then shortly after his honorable discharge, Gary went on to become a licensed practical nurse. And he even worked at a VA psych hospital for a time before being fired. And he got fired because he had rude behavior towards his patients. So from 1962 to around 1987, Gary spent majority of his time in and out of psychiatric hospitals, but this time he wasn't working, he was actually a patient himself. He was prone to extreme bouts of depression with multiple suicide attempts. So then later on, Gary went on to marry and have children with several women. However, the relationships were far from normal. The first marriage was to a woman named Betty. How they met, not really sure, but they were writing letters back and forth. She really knew nothing about him. She came to the US from the Philippines. They got married. He would force Betty to watch as he had sex with other women, and he repeatedly would and assault her numerous times until she was able to escape and she fled back home to her country. At that time when she fled back home, she was pregnant with this child, and this really upset him. So then Gary had another child with a woman named Anjanette, and she was mentally disabled. She had an IQ of only 48. So she was mentally disabled, and he took advantage of her. He got her pregnant, and the child was immediately taken away. So Anjanette was more than just like a sexual conquest for Gary. She was his official transition into the crimes that would be coming. So Anjanette, Gary's girlfriend at the time, had a sister, and she was staying in a mental hospital or institution. And in 1978, he signed his girlfriend's sister out of the mental institution where she was living. She was brought back to the home where Gary and Anjanette were living. Now, Gary decided to just keep her here, the sister, for 10 days, and he repeatedly and tortured her. Police went looking for the sister because she was signed out of this mental institution. It was like a day pass, so you could take her for a couple of hours. Gary was the one that signed her out, so of course they went to his house, and when police finally found her, she was covered in blood, and she was just completely terrified, and she was hiding. She was covered in blood, and she was just completely terrified, and she was hiding in the basement. Gary was charged with kidnapping, unlawful restraint, false imprisonment, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, and interfering with the custody of a committed person. Now, when I read that, I was like, oh, yeah, he would be locked up forever, right? Because that's a long list of some effed up shiznits. Nay. Of course not. Gary's original sentence was overturned on appeal, and Gary spent only 3 years of his incarceration in mental institutions. So there's that. So then in 1971, Gary was out, right? And he moved to Philadelphia. And while in Philadelphia, Gary was like, you know what? I gotta do something, right? He really liked controlling people. So in 1971, Gary started the United Church of the Ministers of God. Now, Gary took this name. So in 1971, Gary started the United Church of the Ministers of God. Now, Gary took this name and kind of created his own church. So if you see a church and it's called United Church of the Ministers of God, it has nothing to do with Gary. So he raised up about $500,000 from people donating their money. And at this time, he seemed to really master and learn how to manipulate people. So according to Gary's neighbors, the members of this cult/church, they showed up every Sunday for service inside of Gary's home. And this is a quote from the neighbor in an interview. Everybody who attended this church, they were usually mentally ill. So Gary went out, and in the area where he lived, there were a lot of sex workers. And he comes across this woman named Josephina Rivera, and she was 25 at the time. He lures her into his car by the promise of money in exchange for sex. So while Josephina was getting redressed after doing whatever they did, I'm assuming, Gary came up and choked her until she passed out. He then takes her back to his home, dragged her down to his basement, shackled her limbs together with chains. He sealed the bolts with super glue so she couldn't escape. Now, Gary had built this thing in his basement, or like dug it up. It was called like a pit, a big hole in the ground. And his thought process was he was going to put people in these things and then like board them up in these pits. So he had built this pit already, and he put Josephina into the pit, or a pit, because he had multiple, boarded it up and sealed her in there. So Josephina was locked up there for about 3 days. And then Gary shows up with another woman named Sandra, and she was 24. It was obvious to Josephina that Sandra, was mentally disabled. So same thing, Gary took Sandra and he chained her in the same fashion as Josephina. And then disgustingly, he would force the other women to watch as he each other. How awful, how awful. On New Year's Day in 1987, Deborah was brought into the basement. Now, later it would be said that Deborah was more feisty, like she was confrontational, wasn't afraid to stand up to Gary and like spit in his face and stuff like he deserved. One day after Gary realized that the girls could hear him coming and going out the front door, he shoved screwdrivers into their ears and punctured their eardrums so they couldn't hear him anymore. Gary would put them on punishment if they decided to disobey him, which meant that they would be starved, beaten, and tortured. So January 18th, 1987, there was one more victim that was now added to the mix that Gary somehow got. Her name was Jacqueline, and she was 18 years old. And it seemed like at this point, Gary was a little content with the amount of girls he had in the basement. But then Sandra somehow disobeyed him. I'm not sure what she did, but she disobeyed him. As punishment, he then put Sandra into the pit, which was like this hole in the ground, right? And he boarded her up. While Gary was like upstairs doing whatever, she tried to crawl out of the pit that Gary had dug. So since Sandra was disobeying him, he then took Sandra and he got her by her wrist and hung her from like a beam that was across the wall with handcuffs. And he then starved her for days as part of her punishment. All the other ladies in that basement were also bound and like chained and stuff, so they couldn't help her or like help her get down at all. Finally, Gary went downstairs to take her off punishment, I guess. So he takes her down from this beam, and sadly she just like fell to the floor. She was dead. So he brought Sandra's body upstairs and he decided that he needed to dismember her body. I'm not clear as far as which girls it was from downstairs, but he brought them upstairs to help him dismember Sandra's body. He then took Sandra, her dismembered body now, and he cooked her ribs in the oven, and then he boiled her head on the stove. He then grounds Sandra's body, like all the meat up, and he fed pieces of Sandra to his dog. He then mixes some of Sandra's body up with dog food. He mixes it together, and then he fed it to all of his captives that are down in the cellar. So one of the other captives, Deborah, she was punished, and I guess he would do this with the other girls as well, and he would electrocute them, and he would create in the pit that he dug up, he would put water in the pit, and then he would have the girls like sit in the water, and he would electrocute them. Sadly, Deborah died. He ended up just taking her body and dumping it somewhere not that far away, but This compelled Gary to abduct another victim, and her name was Agnes. Gary had expressed to his victims that he wanted kids and that his goal was to get 10 girls down into his cellar. But he also wanted to get them all pregnant, and he wanted to have what he called a baby farm in his cellar. But at this point, one of Gary's victims started to figure him out. Josephina began to realize that Gary had a desire for true connection, and he was just lonely. And Josephina set out to befriend Gary, and she needed to convince him that she was on his side. So she just did as he wished. Eventually, Gary allowed her to go upstairs and